Lockmuller Group, in partnership with EDSI, completed a traffic study of Hampton Avenue in 2019. And the purpose of that study was to determine if this reducing traffic lanes was feasible. Now, why would we want to do that? Well, Hampton Avenue really is an arterial street that prioritizes vehicle traffic. There's a desire to more effectively serve all modes of travel, including pedestrians and bicyclists. There's ongoing reinvigoration of commercial buildings along the corridor and a desire to continue to attract businesses and build up some of the restaurants and support them and continue that economic growth in the corridor. We'd also like to make the neighborhoods more walkable, which is something that is of interest to people. So this project was sponsored by the Ward 12 and Ward 16 aldermen and was led by the City of St. Louis Board of Public Service, of which Ms. Brenna Brown is here this evening as their representative. So the study limits was Hampton Avenue from Chippewa at the north to Gravois Avenue to the south. The study included a wide range of things, including crash and safety analysis. It looked at traffic capacity. We took into consideration pedestrian and bicycle routes. We did counts of traffic, pedestrians, and bicyclists. We took speed measurements, and we also looked at on-street parking in terms of how frequently spaces were being utilized. So it was a very comprehensive analysis. So let's start with existing conditions. And now everything here is pre-COVID. This data and study was really conducted in 2019 last year. So any COVID-related impacts to traffic wouldn't be reflected here in this data. But we counted about 16,000 cars a day using Hampton. And just a rough threshold of where a lane reduction is feasible based on industry guidelines says that under 20,000 is generally an acceptable range. It doesn't mean that a lane reduction wouldn't work above 20,000. That's just a typical threshold for where it does work. So already just right off the bat, the volumes are in a good spot in terms of whether or not this is going to be feasible. We do recognize that Hampton is very much a commuter corridor. Traffic's heavier northbound in the morning, southbound in the afternoon. Hampton tends to be busier towards the north, up near Chippewa. As you move south, volumes tend to diminish, and then it gets a little bit busier again once you get down to Gravois. We do have a posted speed limit of 35 miles an hour, but our study did find that 24% of motorists are driving faster than 35, and even 5% are going faster than 40. So we do have some folks out there that are driving above the speed limit, and so that's something of interest here as we move forward. The corridor is very multimodal. We've got a Metro bus route on Hampton. We do have a designated bike St. Louis route on Hampton south of Eichelberger. It does have intermittent on-street lanes down to Gravois, and we'll talk a little bit more about that here when we start talking about the lane reduction. But one of the big things we noticed with regards to multimodal infrastructure is that there's no pedestrian crosswalk across Hampton between Loughborough and Gravois, which is a distance of over a half mile. And that's particularly interesting given that we've got Wilmore Park along Hampton for a good chunk of that stretch. So that's something that we're also paying attention to. Parking. So we did an inventory of parking along this stretch, and we found that there are approximately 500 on-street spaces. We did look at parking during the middle of the day on a weekday and found that utilization was pretty low. That's the graphic on the left. So you can see lots of blue and light blue that indicates parking on those particular segments was less than 50% utilized, meaning at least half the spaces were available. We also looked at a Friday evening between 6 and 8 p.m. when we know the restaurants are busy. And we found that parking is pretty busy, but it wasn't full. So you can see the yellow and the red in those sections between Holly Hills and Nottingham, where we did see parking at 70, 80, and even 90% utilized, but we generally had room there for a few additional cars. On-street parking to the south along Wilmore Park was very sparingly used. Traffic engineers typically grade intersection performance by levels of service, which are rated A through F, with A being good and F being poor. And level of service D is generally considered acceptable for peak periods, particularly in urban areas. So as you'll note, all the intersections between Chippewa and Gravois operate at level of service C during those peak hours. So there's really not much traffic congestion in the center part of this corridor. This is notwithstanding, of course, Chippewa and Gravois intersections on the end, but the intersections in the middle generally function with minimal congestion. So the lane reduction concept is really developed to address those overarching goals that Alderman Oldenburg talked about at the beginning. And so the concept here would convert Hampton from 4 lanes to 3. It would not change Hampton at either Chippewa or at Gravois. So the sections that you see on the graphic there in red would remain as they are today. We would transition to a 3-lane section in blue in the middle of the corridor. We would also improve intersections by doing bump outs at signals to shorten the pedestrian crossing distances. This concept also enables shorter traffic signal cycles. I appreciate some of the emails we received from folks tonight, and I know that was a comment that was raised, and this would do that. It also maintains on-street parking. We're not taking any on-street parking within the center of the corridor. We are talking about removing on-street parking south of Jamieson along Wilmar Park only. This also would allow us to complete bike lanes between Gravois and Loughborough. So we already have bike lanes in the northbound direction between Gravois and Loughborough, but in the southbound direction, there are some gaps that this would allow us to complete. Just another note on bike lanes, we did not look at changing the bike routes within this part of St. Louis City that have been established by Bike St. Louis, which has Hampton as a bike route south of Eichelberger. We did not look at making any changes to that. We just looked at completing a gap in that existing bike lanes on southbound Hampton. So as far as the cross section goes, that's the diagram there on the far right. So we would look at having 2 9-foot parking lanes on each side of the street, along with a 12-foot lane for traffic in each direction, as well as a 13-foot center 2-way left turn lane. So that's what the 3-lane section would look like. As far as the benefits of doing that, so published research shows that road diets or lane reductions do improve safety. And so an overall crash reduction of 29% is the number that we think would apply to this type of corridor. And the percentage would be slightly higher for intersection or injury crashes. And one of the reasons for that is that it's much easier to driveway to pull onto Hampton in terms of safety and having line of sight, because instead of looking at traffic, imagine if you're making a left turn out of a driveway. Today you have to look at moving traffic in 4 lanes, 2 coming southbound and 2 going northbound, and that reduces to just 1 lane in each direction. So it's a simpler and safer maneuver from that standpoint. Parking, this provides more space for the existing on-street parking. So instead of parking in a narrow 7-foot lane, you'll now have 9 feet of width to park in. And as I said, the removal of that unused parking along Wilmore Park helps complete the bike lanes. From a traffic flow standpoint, this enables shorter traffic signal cycles, which will equal improved performance from a traffic standpoint in some regards. Some intersections will actually see improvements in level of service, but no intersections will experience a worse level of service than they do today with this concept. Speeds will be reduced. Case studies show that an average reduction of 5 miles an hour is common, and that's because the lane reduction, the elimination of that second lane restricts people from passing slower moving traffic. So you sort of have some self-regulation of traffic flow by having just the single lane in each direction. Pedestrians, I mentioned the curb bump outs, which reduce crossing distances at intersections, and the slower traffic really helps promote that more welcoming environment for pedestrians and cyclists. So there are some drawbacks potentially. So we're trying to provide an objective analysis of this. So we're looking at benefits, and we're also looking at potential drawbacks. So there is the potential that some folks will perceive that there is some congestion during the peak periods, and that's largely because you're not going to be able to pass that slower moving car in front of you. And so it may create that perception that there is some congestion. Probably one of the hottest topics here is traffic diversions. So we do see some traffic diversions from these types of projects. The city's experience is that up to 10% of traffic diverts to other routes. Some of the published research that we've shown shows 2 to 15% of traffic could divert. It's really important to note that that's the total amount of traffic diversions, and that not all that traffic diverts to a single route, but it's really spread across multiple routes. So I know Jamieson is something that's been mentioned, but it's not that all 10% would go to Jamieson. Some would go to Kings Highway, some might go to River to Pear, some could go to Macklin. There's a variety of corridors that could see some additional traffic. And I will emphasize that the aldermen are open to exploring additional treatments to help mitigate diversions if this project were to move forward. Queuing. So this is probably the thing that most people will notice after this project is implemented, is that you may take more time to turn from Hampton, from driveways onto Hampton during the peak periods. You also can expect some longer lines of traffic on Hampton at the Nottingham and Eichelberger intersections during the peak period. However, traffic is generally going to clear on a single green signal, and there's going to be some traffic flow benefits from having a shorter traffic signal cycle, meaning instead of waiting 2 minutes for the traffic signal to cycle, we can probably wait 1.5 minutes. So some of these longer queues are going to be offset by traffic flowing more smoothly due to improved signal timing. But those longer queues are probably what most folks will notice as a result of this project. And so at the end of the day, there's a little bit of a trade-off between having a little bit longer queues during peak periods, but yet realizing the benefits of doing the lane reduction at all other times of the day when traffic is lower and you don't have the queuing, but yet you do have the reductions in speeds and some of the other, and the pedestrian benefits and some of the other things that we talked about. So one location that I did want to call some attention to is Hampton and Jamieson. So we do recommend additional improvements at this location to address safety, regardless of the lane reduction, just due to the absence of any sort of pedestrian crossing at this location and due to the safety issues that we've seen. So the concept here shows Jamieson reduced to 3 lanes at Hampton. We're not changing Jamieson away from the intersection, but at Hampton, we would just have a left turn lane and a right turn lane, as well as 1 lane heading north on Jamieson. We would add crosswalks across the north side and the west side. And we would recommend doing a raised pedestrian median refuge on that north side of Hampton so that folks only have to cross 1/2 of Hampton at a time. And then we're suggesting the implementation of what's called a rectangular flashing beacon at that crosswalk. And that is something that would be push button activated, so that as a pedestrian needs to cross the street, it would activate that device to signal to motorists that there is someone in the crosswalk crossing the street. We did not recommend a traffic signal at this location because the volumes are really not high enough to warrant a traffic signal based on the standard warrants that the Federal Highway Administration publishes. So the city would be reluctant to install a signal here that did not meet those warrants. So conclusion, we did this study to really provide information to help evaluate the pros and cons and feasibility of doing that lane reduction on Hampton. Based on the volumes, Hampton is a good candidate for the lane reduction. And based on our more detailed study of individual intersections, we've determined that the lane reduction would not impact levels of service and that the longer queues are the thing you're going to notice most. We believe that this would help contribute to that safer environment and more welcoming environment for pedestrians and cyclists. And we do recommend, though, that you move forward with Hampton and Jamieson improvements irrespective of this lane reduction. Now, in terms of costs, those would vary depending upon the level of implementation. And so next slide, Katie. The last slide here, there's 3 different options that were priced out for how to implement this project. The lowest cost option on the left would just essentially include pavement markings and some bollards that would help define the bump outs at the intersections, but it wouldn't include anything else. And that's sort of the bare bones option. The middle option would include the pavement markings, but it would also include more longer lasting and higher visibility MMA paint, which is a plastic style paint that you can see there in the photo in the maroon that would be used to color the bump outs and help to channel and define some of these intersections in combination with the bollards and the regular pavement markings. The full cost option would be the full curb bump outs where we're physically moving the curbs at the intersection. We're upgrading the ADA and pedestrian signal infrastructure at the intersections, and we're doing the full Hampton Jamieson recommendations. So I'll emphasize that these costs exclude pavement resurfacing of Hampton. However, that is already funded and is included assumed it would be included with all of these options. So with that, I think we can take any questions unless Alderwoman Grass or Alderman Oldenburg would like to add any further comments.
Chris, I just need to take a moment to unmute the Alder people. So give me just a second.
No, Chris, the only thing I would add is just to underscore again, your last point there is that both the 16th and the 12th ward have already appropriated and set aside funds to resurface Hampton. We know that that's going to happen. So it's very important that we get the feedback and this plan evaluated certainly before we would do that. And if it's decided that this isn't a welcomed event, we'll still repave Hampton, is what I would
add. Yeah, that works for me. I don't think we have to make a decision tonight, and we need to talk about it and find out how everybody's feeling.
Sure.
All right, would you like to take some questions from the chat box?
Yes, I'm going to scroll up to the top here and anxious to understand why and how Alderman Grass's viewpoint changed since she is Alderman now. Alderwoman Grass, would you want to answer that one?
Really just talking to citizens and seeing how, I mean, they were curious to know how I felt about Hampton, and my initial reaction was, I think Hampton's fine the way it is. But then after listening to those folks that live on those smaller streets that are east and west of Hampton Avenue, safety seemed to be a big concern. So I started looking at Hampton differently when I was driving it. Coming out of those side streets, getting on Hampton is troublesome at best. And whether this helps that or not, I don't know. But I think those are those questions that still need to be answered. So really, it was just talking to citizens and seeing how they felt. It changed my mind.
Okay, thank you, Alderwoman Grass. From Timothy Flavin, could it be feasible to implement bike lanes on both sides of the street for the full length of the corridor? So we did not revisit the Bike St. Louis bike routes. I think it would be challenging to get bike lanes along the entire length of the corridor without affecting on-street parking, which we did not want to do. And also volumes get much higher as you get closer towards Chippewa to the north, to the point where I think the biking environment would not be comfortable for most bicyclists. So for those reasons, we just attempted to reinforce the existing Bike St. Louis route along Hampton south of Eichelberger, where we had those gaps in the on-street lanes. From Matt Bauer, what was learned and what was the neighborhood resident and business reaction to the South Grand Business District lane reduction? Any change to sale numbers from the business along the corridor? I don't have specific numbers to cite, but my understanding is that that project was very well received and has been is viewed as a success by both the neighborhoods as well as the businesses. And I don't know if Ms. Brown from the city of St. Louis has anything to add to that.
So it was mostly very well received. For the most part, the people who were commuting, who got frustrated by any additional or a slowdown of South Grand, moved to a different way of getting to and from. It really slowed down the corridor, which was really important for Grand because it had a major speeding problem. And those businesses weren't doing as well because people didn't feel safe parking next to them. So it's been really great. I don't have exact numbers, but I have a feeling that someone does, and we can look into that if you'd like.
Okay, great, thank you. David Neighbors, what input has our public safety department had during the survey? Is there a concern that the congestion and longer lines of traffic at the traffic light impact emergency response to incidents? So I don't know that we have gotten direct feedback from public safety. But I will say that I think the addition of the center two-way left turn lane can help aid emergency response during those peak periods, and that it gives emergency responders that center lane to move around traffic. So no, I don't believe there will be an impact to emergency response incidents as a result of doing this.
Chris, I've got a question for you.
Yep.
It looks like one of our participants is interested to know if there are features in place to prevent traffic from rerouting onto the residential streets, in particular Jamieson, Eichelberg, and Nottingham.
So one thing I failed to mention is that we recognize that Jamieson is a corridor of interest from the feedback that we've received. And so Alderman Oldenburg intends to study Jamieson as a future study to try and address some of the same issues on Jamieson that you're seeing on Hampton. So I think that's something that I failed to mention during the presentation. But as far as residential streets, I think there are options to help prevent traffic from rerouting down residential streets, including speed humps and other traffic calming measures. And I know both aldermen indicated they're open to exploring what those measures might be if in fact this project moves forward and there are impacts on particular residential streets. I don't know if either alderman would like to elaborate on any of that.
Could you repeat that, Chris?
We had talked about, the question pertains to impacts to traffic rerouting down residential streets. And I mentioned the ability to do traffic calming on residential streets, including speed humps and other types of treatments, if in fact the project moves forward and does create, cut through on a residential street. And I indicated that both you and Alderman Oldenburg indicated you were open to exploring those types of options if needed.
Absolutely, yes. We sure are in the 12th Ward. People that are coming off of Hampton in the 12th Ward are asking for speed humps all the time. So we would certainly be open to that.
Okay, thank you. Comment about the neighborhood not being walkable and sidewalks everywhere on the street. Yeah, absolutely. The neighborhoods are very walkable. I think what we've heard from some of the feedback is that Hampton Avenue, in terms of trying to get across the street, might not be the most walkable in terms of waiting a long time to cross the street, signal push buttons not working. And so I think the goal is to slow traffic down on Hampton and make the Hampton corridor feel safer for people who are pedestrians and make it easier for folks to cross the street.
Yeah, when we talk about walkability, we really want to get across the big streets, because if we can't get across them, then we end up putting up these barriers to walking the whole city. So right now, Hampton's a bit of a barrier, especially if you take people with small children or in a wheelchair. I wouldn't necessarily feel comfortable in either of those cases crossing Hampton. So this is really trying to make it accessible to everyone. Walkability.
Yep, great.
Here's a question. With COVID affecting more restaurant pickups, do you think any of these changes will help people with the pickup and drop off that takes place on Hampton?
Well, I think absolutely having the wider parking lane, 2 additional feet there, will make that drop off and pickup feel a lot more comfortable than it is today in 7 feet. And then also by having fewer traffic lanes adjacent to you on Hampton and having that traffic going a little bit slower, I think will also help make that pickup and drop off occur a little bit more safely.
There's another question here about what are the Metro bus uses along this route, and is there a feasibility option for a dedicated bus lane?
Oh, that's a great question. So we do know that Metro Bus has a single route on Hampton. We know that it has approximately 20 buses a day going up and down Hampton. I don't think, I think dedicated bus lanes are something that's very interesting, and they've been discussed quite a bit here in St. Louis, although I don't know that we have really an example of them anywhere. We might in the not too distant future, but I don't necessarily think that this location would be a great location to pilot that, because I think it would potentially require the removal of on-street parking. And I also don't know that there's really enough bus volume on this particular corridor to really warrant the dedicated lane. You typically like those to use those where you've got multiple routes on the same street and you've got a little bit higher frequency of buses. But great question.
There's also a couple questions here. One from Jackie asking, are there any mid-block or additional crossings between Nottingham and Eichelberger? While the distance might not be too long on a map, it is a good distance to go out and walk back and forth to the businesses on both sides of the street.
We did not include any mid-block crossing at that location, but that's certainly something that could be added into the project, depending on whether we're, if it's just a striped mid-block crosswalk, perhaps with some signage or something like that, or a small bump out. That's something that could probably be incorporated into the project. So yeah, I appreciate that comment.
We have a request to show the proposed improvements again. So I'm going to back us up. And we'll be like to be looking at this intersection. Chris, where would you like to land?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if this is what the question pertains to, but this was the concept that we showed. We do have similar concepts for the other intersections that involve the bump outs and making the intersections smaller so that the crossing distances aren't as large, aren't as long. But yeah, essentially it's this type of concept here where you've got the one lane in each direction. You've got the middle lane that's two-way left turn lane, also functions as a dedicated left turn lane at those major intersections. And then this is the south part of the corridor. So you can see this one also includes that bike lane. That northbound bike lane through this intersection is already there today. And this one would add the southbound bike lane to mirror that northbound one.
Are there any one-way streets being considered to change direction that feed into Hampton?
No, there's no proposed changes to any of the intersecting neighborhood streets in conjunction with this project. And I think that's something, and there was a study done several years ago that did look at neighborhood streets within Ward 16 and did result in some changes from two-way to one-way, or I think alternating the orientation of some one-way streets. And so I think that same type of thing could be considered here if the project moves forward and there's a need to address any cut-through traffic that would result from this. But we don't anticipate any major residential cut-throughs occurring as a result of doing this.
Another question, with the increase of traffic on Jamieson, let's see, the crossings at Wilmore, at Tennis and Loughborough would be more dangerous. Will any walkways or crossings made be ADA accessible?
Yeah, so again, the Loughborough, or I'm sorry, the Jamieson corridor is going to be the next one to be studied. So any changes to Jamieson would be addressed as part of that future study.
There are some questions, not specific at any point here, but some questions about implementation. What is the potential timeline for a project like this? And could it be done in stages?
Stages, absolutely. And that's one of the reasons we provided these various cost options, because you could implement the project using the low cost option, and then as additional funding becomes available, you could provide additional upgrades at different locations along the corridor. So for example, you could do the low cost option with just the pavement markings throughout, test that out for a year, decide if it's working. If it's not, it's a simple restriping. Then as additional monies become available, you could target the Hampton Jamieson intersection for the full upgrades at that location. So there's a variety of different ways you could do this. And essentially one way to think about it is we're sort of providing a menu of options, and you can implement them incrementally as you go, as you get more comfortable with the improvements and as more funding becomes available. And I'll defer to the alderman as far as the timing or funding sources for potentially implementing something. Looks like Alderman Oldenburg is muted, Katie.
Oh, let me go back and find him. Alderman, you'll have to unmute yourself if you want to speak. Yes.
Now we're good. Thank you. Thank you. That's right. Chris alluded that or corroborated that this absolutely could be done in stages. I think it's anticipated that we will, if it moves forward, in the sense of what do we take the biggest bite of in terms of safety. I mean, that's what always drives, I would think, my decision making is 100, and right, Chris, 165 accidents in 2-year period. I mean, that's pretty high. And if you can reduce that by 20 or 30%, that potentially saves lives too. So those are things that I think are worth considering. First and foremost is how do we make it safer? And of course, you know, there likely would be growing pains if we decide this is something we need to move forward with. And almost, I can assure you, it will be done in phases because of the financial constraints that the city has right now, particularly with what gets sourced toward capital dollars. So that also allows us to be prudent and tinker, right, with one approach, one mitigant, and measure it and capture that data. And if it's improving and impacting in a positive way, then let's move to the next one or try to mirror that one elsewhere. And I real quick, and then you can mute me again. I did want to address the side streets here that are impacted and what are further treatments that can possibly get done. That also absolutely is part of this equation. I know for Alderman Grass and myself as well. There are some heavy hit streets as a result of successful businesses, and we want to keep dynamic businesses in Hampton Avenue. We know that keeps property values high when you're in close proximity to dynamic and commercial business and retail particularly. So the concern needs to be what other dollars do we need to carve off, and what ropes do we need to push up hills to ensure that folks that are on some of those heavy hit streets like Walsh, Delore, Eichelberger to a certain extent, and how can we do further mitigants, whether it is reversing the street to an outflow of Hampton, or if it is also speed hump mitigation. So that absolutely is going to be what I would call a supplement to probably going to take place, whether this will move forward or not.
I actually have a question here. It looks like it's for Brenna. And it's related to the traffic diversion that you talked about. You said 10% of traffic is diverted onto side streets. So does that mean 90% of the traffic remains on Hampton? Is that what you have seen in the city of St. Louis?
That is what we have seen. And that's more than just Grand. That's Grand, that's Compton for part of it, and a couple of other spots. We see basically 10% is what happens in the city. I also, if I can for a moment, I'd like to address something that's going on in the chat where it suggests, hey, we're taking away 2 lanes of traffic on Hampton, see what happens to the traffic. And I understand the thought process there, but it's really more like going from 2 lanes to 1.5 lanes in each direction. And I know that can sound kind of silly, but since you have that lane in the middle for people to turn, they're not stopping a lane of through traffic. So as they pull out into that middle lane, the people are still passing through, and we actually see the traffic usually run better in a 3-lane section than a 4-lane section. So I just thought I would point that out because it's really more like going to 1.5 lanes instead of 2 lanes, instead of just 1 lane each direction.
Yeah, that's a great point, Brenna. I mean, we don't see these projects creating traffic Armageddon. It's not all of a sudden going to be in gridlock to the point where traffic is taking any route possible to get away from the corridor. It's really just going to be during the middle of the day, during 18, 19, 20 hours of the day, this isn't even going to be noticeable from a traffic flow standpoint. It's during those peak periods, as I mentioned, we'll have a little bit longer queuing at a couple of intersections, but we are going to improve the signal timing. We're going to lower those cycle lengths so you don't have to wait as long to cross the street. And some of those improvements are going to offset some of that waiting a little bit longer in line at a couple of those intersections. So in terms of it taking longer to get up and down the corridor, we don't anticipate a meaningful difference in the total travel time across the whole distance. So I know there's a lot of traffic concerns in the chat, but I would just emphasize that we don't anticipate this creating a major traffic headache.
And then
Please continue to submit your questions in the chat box and we will address them as best we can.
may I do one more, Katie?
Of course.
All right, there's a lot of chatter also in the chat, and I'm not going to address a single discussion, but talks about, should we just be, instead of trying to make these changes, just be getting more police out there to actually check on parking and traffic, if we're having any speed volumes. And I just want to take a moment to talk about, there are many different ways to solve a problem. And with the funding that's available here, what we can do is we can build things to stop the problems from happening. And it tends to be more effective than necessarily policing, or policing is very reactive. This is trying to stop the problems from happening in the first place. Not saying that it's not a decent way of doing things, but that's how we're coming to this approach. Is if we can stop the problems from happening in the first place, then maybe that can give the police more time to go do other things. Or if they can't make it here now, then maybe we need to accept that and find other ways to stop the problems. Just generally speaking.
Another question for you, Brenna. Are you aware when Hampton will be repaved?
So this is mostly just a scheduling issue. It'll come from the aldermen when they want to repave. The funding is already there. I can tell you it's not going to happen this year. We're too late in the season weather-wise. The earliest it could happen would be next spring, but we're not going to go ahead until the aldermen tell us to.
Chris, can you talk about the previous traffic studies like this in the city and the resulting success and/or failure? I appreciate the effort put into this study, and I'm curious about how it worked elsewhere.
Well, I'll probably let Brenna speak to that question, because I think she's the one that has some of the results of some of the other projects that the city's done.
Yeah. So on Compton, we did a traffic study to see if there was a whole bunch of speeding there. They ended up putting up those bollards in bump outs. And that's the section between Lafayette and Gravois. And that ended up slowing down traffic by 5 miles per hour on average, which was just absolutely lovely. And that came from we did a study, we made a reaction, and then we got the results. Similarly, there was a project inside Carondelet Park. We recently put in a couple of roundabouts in Carondelet Park down on Holly Hills Boulevard, and that project just got installed. So I can't give you end results, but we are noticing people are slowing down. We have done some other big traffic studies on bigger streets, but they haven't happened yet. But the two that have happened in the past on slightly bigger streets are like Arsenal between Kings Highway and Grand, that went through and had a lane reduction. And then of course, the Grand project.
There is one question here. It may be off topic, and I'm sure you guys can see it in the chat box. Would this sort of lane reduction do anything about street racing?
Well, that's a great question. I think yes, it could certainly. It's certainly not going to make it worse. But yes, when you have a couple of cars that are stopped in an intersection and they decide, you know, they're going to side by side drag race down the street, this makes that certainly more difficult, because you're going to have other cars in that middle lane that are turning left at that intersection, and there's not going to be an ability to do that. So, so yes, I would think that it would help with that type of behavior.
Would there be a change in commute times during the busiest time of day? There was also a question, change in travel time to 44.
Yeah, I don't think there's going to be a significant change in travel times. I really don't. I think you're talking about a minute or two, very close to what your current travel time is. I don't think that'll be a significant difference from what you experience today.
There was a question about the signal timing. Is that planned as part of this study?
Yes, so there is budget to modify the signal timings south of Chippewa all the way down to Gravois. We wouldn't modify Chippewa and Gravois, but the goal would be to run a lower traffic signal cycle within this corridor, which would better match the traffic that you have, as opposed to the longer timings that you have at Chippewa and at Gravois at those bigger intersections. And that by doing that, you're going to see some traffic flow benefits within this lane reduced section that will help offset some of the longer queues and being a little bit longer line to get through some of the busier intersections. And so that signal optimization is included in the budget for each of the three options.
In addition, does that mean that the speed limit will change, or will the speed limit on Hampton remain the same?
That's another great question. We did not provide a recommendation on the speed limits. Those tend to be, I don't know, Brennan, do you want to elaborate on speed limit setting in the city and the policy from your perspective?
Yes, so the speed limits are set by the street department. This is a major arterial, so we are not planning on changing the speed limit. That being said, we do want to make sure that there's limited to no speeding the corridor, and if traffic speeds tend to go a little slower, that's great, but I think the speed limit will stay at 35 miles per hour.
Also, we have some curious questions here about roundabouts. Were roundabouts considered in this design, and why or why not?
The only location where a roundabout would fit would probably be at Hampton and Jamieson, although that would likely require acquiring some property from Wilmore Park. Roundabouts are a great traffic solution, but I know one of the concerns is pedestrian crossings of the roundabout, particularly for folks that may have impairments, because traffic isn't required to stop. And so I know that's always a concern with a roundabout, but no, we didn't consider a roundabout for that location because of the property needs and having to acquire property from the park and deal with that. And we thought that just by making the intersection smaller, having those defined crossing locations, having the median refuge on Hampton, we thought that those were really going to help address some of the circumstances at that location and address the safety issues.
It was out of the scope to consider roundabouts for this particular study, but also moving to a 3-lane section also helps if we wanted to put roundabouts inside the future. 2-lane roundabouts tend to be, I'm going to go with trickier to design than single lane roundabouts, and they're trickier to drive in. And we've noticed that people in St. Louis are still getting used to the 1-lane roundabouts that we have. And so we didn't want to quite make that kind of leap at this point.
So as we near the top of the hour, how can those who participated today, if they have any questions or want to provide more feedback, how can they reach out? And what are the next steps?
So I think for more information, right, they are to direct their questions to you, Brenna, is that correct?
Yeah. And I will get it to the correct people. I may
And then
not answer each of you individually, but we will make sure that the information gets out and that at least the aldermen certainly know everything. And if there's a particular question, we'll get it answered.
Yeah, we very much appreciate all of you that have taken time to email us already. We have shared all that comment and feedback with the city. So we appreciate folks that have already taken the time to do so.
And when will people know if there's something's going to happen in the future, or how will they learn about any changes?
I think Alderman Oldenburg is muted again.
He's got to unmute himself this time.
Got it. You guys are good with that. So to put kind of a bookend on just tonight and where things go. Obviously, Brenna can be a resource that she can help answer some technical questions. Lockmuller is not going anywhere either in terms of us needing a technical answer or expertise. Also, you can always reach out to myself, and I assume the same goes for Alderman Grass if there are any questions. What I will say is this doesn't tonight. It's not over. You know, I think I've talked with Alderwoman Grass. We're going to do also a survey to everyone that was here tonight, as well as try to make that more encompassing in terms of reaching the entire neighborhood to get everyone's thoughts on this. And then additionally, I'd like to have, although we may not have Lockmuller or the technical experts, but I would like to have another discussion to make sure that everyone's answers or everyone's questions that they had tonight get answered. I also do want to address that I have sent this to the fire chief as well as the chief of police to have them weigh in if there's any analysis or opining that they can do in terms of making sure this doesn't hinder them in their jobs. So that has also part of the discussion that I want to have. We don't want to have any unintended negative impacts associated with this. So that was brought to us by a resident, and I thank him for that. So that's also an important, it was brought up tonight too. So that's an important point I also want to cover. So with further questions, follow-ups, concerns, feedback, you can always reach out to myself again, or Alderwoman Grass if you're in the 12th ward, and we'll work with the Board of Public Service. What I would say is we've got some time in the sense to make sure that we're hearing everyone's feedback. So again, I don't think we could even repave Hampton Avenue again until the spring. So we're going to want to catalog everyone's information. So I would anticipate sometime before spring that we kind of hopefully reach a consensus whether we think the recommendations, whether it's part of these recommendations, all of these recommendations, or a hybrid are made prior to repaving. Also, thanks everyone. I appreciate you all taking time tonight. I really do. I didn't expect we'd have over 100 people, so that's good. Nothing else.
All right.
Okay. Alderwoman Grass, do you want to add anything to close?
She said, I'm good.
Okay.
I said I'm muted.
Oh, I'm muted.
I just like to say thanks to everybody too. The turnout is really awesome, and this is only just the beginning. It really was a public hearing just so we can figure out what everybody wants to do and how we can move forward with this. So we look forward to hearing from you guys in the future.
All right.
That's all I got.
Brenna, anything you want to add? Okay, well, I guess we'll go ahead and close the meeting. Thank you very much for your participation tonight. Appreciate everybody taking the time to listen to our presentation, and I hope we were able to, I know we weren't able to answer everyone's questions, but hopefully we were able to provide some clarification on this, and appreciate your time. Have a great evening.
Good night.
Good night.